All right, Renaissance and Reformation, part 3. Some of the achievements. We're really going to go over literature, education, and politics during the Renaissance. So the intellectual impact of the Renaissance on scholarship and literature. So the Renaissance humanists studied classical Roman and Greek literature, poetry, and philosophy. The Italian scholar Petrarch, the father of humanism, collected and studied ancient texts. So new methods of criticizing texts led some, like Erasmus, to question the church. Other Renaissance authors wrote on secular, which means non-religious subjects. So the more they studied the Greeks, the more they studied the Roman, which were pre-Christian literature, the more they kind of break away from the church. So Renaissance writers described the dignity of man and celebrated the pleasures of the senses and instructed nobles on how to behave at a prince's court. Bocelio wrote in vernacular, which means a local language, instead of Latin. So at the time in Italy, what they had was most literature was in Latin, and that was not the language that people spoke. That was not the local language. So as the Renaissance spread, writers like Rabelais in France, William Shakespeare in England, and Cervantes in Spain completed the works in their own native language. So they'd be writing in English, they'd be writing in French, and they'd be writing in Spanish. That where more people could actually read it instead of just in the Latin. And then we have Machiavelli. This is going to be kind of the part where we go over politics, and he was a big influencer in politics at that time. Here's some of the quotes from Machiavelli, and I'll read the top left one. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, since you can't have both of those at the same time, we must choose between. If we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than to be loved. So that's kind of his political idea. So Machiavelli was courtier, which means he's the person who's actually there at the court, influencing the king or the prince or whoever it is that's in charge at that time. So he's a politician, he's in Florence, and at that time, that's the most important city-state in Italy. And he writes the book, The Prince, and it's a guidebook in how to secure and maintain political power. And the big thing is secure and maintain. So Machiavelli argued that the most successful rulers are not those who acted according to laws or conscience, but those who were willing to do whatever was necessary to hold power. So his main theory comes as the end justifies the means. So what you get in the end justifies however you got to that point. So the wealth of the Italian city-states, the weakening of the church, and the reasoning of writers like Machiavelli contributed to the Renaissance concept of reason of state. So rulers justified taking whatever measures they needed to strengthen their state in order to survive. They collected taxes, they raised armies, often hiring professional soldiers. They also exchanged ambassadors, creating, modern diplomacy, what we have today, where you send ambassadors to different countries. And rulers in large states like France soon began copying what the Italians were doing. So the economic impact of the Renaissance. Renaissance ideas and products quickly spread all over Europe. People strove to improve their material conditions, so to have more things. Material conditions just means the stuff that you have, while the wealthy accumulated more luxury goods. So this encouraged an increase in trade. If you want more things, people have to make more things, and things are going to get traded more. So a greater variety of products, especially clothes, food, wine, and furnishings, all this stuff actually increased in these cities and actually caused the cities to grow. All right, science and technology during the Renaissance spirit of inquiry, in other words, inquiring, why things are the way they are, led to important discoveries in science. The church had always taught that the earth was the center of the universe and everything went around us. And then Copernicus, a Polish scientist, took careful measurements that led him to conclude that the earth actually went around the sun, which it does. So his works eventually are banned by the church, since it was against what the church said. And this is Copernicus down here at the bottom. And then a big Renaissance scientist was Galileo. And he's a famous Italian scientist, and his studies of motion laid the foundations for modern physics. Galileo's observations with one of the first telescopes strengthened the belief in Copernicus' theory that we went around the sun. So charges are also brought against Galileo by the Catholic Church. That's what the church did back then. And he was told he could no longer publicly state that the earth moved around the sun. And in 1632, he was ordered to appear before the Inquisition in Rome. Inquisition is when the church brings you in to ask you questions about why you were saying things that are contrary to what the church believes. So at his trial, he was found guilty, and he ends up being confined to his home. So, pretty much jailed to his house. And then probably one of the most important discoveries or inventions ever, Gutenberg's revolution in printing. So for thousands of years, Europeans had copied all the scrolls and books by hand. Very slow, very few books. So most of these works were found in monasteries and in church libraries. So the church kind of controlled all writing at that time. Block printing had been invented by China, and it was introduced into Europe in the 1300s. The printer cut out every word on the face of a wooden block, and that would have the letters standing up, and then the letters would be pressed down on a piece of paper. So the block was inked, and then that was pressed down on a piece of paper. So you had block printing from the Chinese, but not what Gutenberg's going to come up with. So with block printing, the printer could make copies of a book, but the blocks took too long to cut out, and each book could only print one page at a time. So Gutenberg comes up with the movable type. So Gutenberg developed printing press, which had movable type in Germany around 1450. Gutenberg created individual letters of metal, which were held together in a frame. So you put a sentence together, these little pieces of little letters, and the type for each page could then be broken down and reused over and over and over again. It was much easier to reset the type than to carve out a block every time you needed a word. So the invention of movable type, along with the use of special presses, oil-based inks, allowed mass production of printed books for the first time ever. So this encouraged the spread of new ideas, and more people began to learn to read. So what impact does Gutenberg have on the Renaissance? This is going to be the spread of ideas everywhere, and almost anyone can now learn to read and write instead of the whole thing being controlled by the church. So you've got the different graphic organizers, the impacts of artists. So they give us perspective. They give us lifelike paintings, things like that. Intellectuals, you have, of course, you're going to have Machiavelli and his different ideas. I'm sorry, that's in political. Political, you have Machiavelli, where the whatever you do to gain power and to keep power, that's fine as long as you are in power. Intellectual and religious impact, you go away from religion during the Renaissance. And then economic impact, people actually started wanting things. They wanted material things. So trade and the growth of cities at that time, kind of reaches its high point.